Good afternoon. I'm again Dr. Regina Reyes, and I'm going to talk about bacterial infections of the nervous system today. And these are the objectives of our lecture: to enumerate and discuss the different CNS bacterial infections, as to microbiology, mechanism of infection, and epidemiology, pathogenesis and clinical manifestations, diagnosis and treatment, and then prognosis. Bacteria can directly infect the meninges, the spaces in between them, and the brain itself, leading to meningitis, thrombophlebitis, subdural and epidural abscesses, brain abscesses, and encephalitis. And bacteria enters the intracranial compartment basically through three ways: through the bloodstream, by extension from adjacent infected cranial structures, and sadly in the course of a cranial or spinal surgery or procedure. It sounds simple that bacteria, as well as other infectious organisms like viruses, can be carried by the bloodstream to the brain to cause infection. But in most cases of bacteremia, or even direct injection of a virulent bacteria into the bloodstream or to the brain itself, does not automatically cause infection, unless a culture medium is injected together with the bacteria, or necrosis is induced at the time of bacterial inoculation. Will it consistently produce infection in experimental animals? In humans, infarction of the brain tissue by arterial or venous thrombosis seems to be a necessary antecedent event to cause necrosis. So here are diagrams to show us how bacteria enters the CNS. So number one is through transcellular migration of the bacteria through pinocytosis or some receptor-mediated mechanisms. Number two, you may also have bacteria in the bloodstream that, following disruption of the blood-CSF barrier or the tight junctions and adherence junctions, no, they enter in the paracellular manner. Okay, and number three is through Trojan horse mechanism, where microbes migrate to the CNS together with infected leukocytes, such as the macrophages. Okay, so the second route of infection intracranially is through extension from infected cranial structures like the bones and like the ears and the paranasal sinuses. So this one is easier to understand. Even if the brain is protected by the cranial bones and the dura mater, this protective mechanism may fail if suppuration occurs in the ears and the paranasal sinuses. And two pathways have been demonstrated. Number one, an infected thrombus may form in the diploic veins, no, inside the skull and spread along the dural sinuses and the meningeal veins going to the brain. Or you may also have an osteomyelitic focus that may erode the inner table of the skull and invade the dura, subdural space, pia arachnoid layer, and the brain. By the way, the subdural and the epidural spaces are practically never the sites of blood-borne infections. So when confronted with a suspected case of CNS infection, make sure to examine the more common sources of contiguous spread, such as the ears, the mastoids, the paranasal sinuses, no? So we can examine the frontal sinuses and the maxillary sinuses, the scalp, the eyes, and the skin surrounding the nose and the upper lip. Lastly, and gaining more importance, is the iatrogenic route. So bacteria gains access to the intracranial compartment in the course of a cranial or spinal surgery, like placement of drains, VP shunts, and other appliances, or through lumbar punctures sometimes. In the recent years and decades, more and more nosocomial or iatrogenic infections are encountered. In some urban hospitals, nosocomial infections are now as frequent as non-hospital acquired infections. In determining the most likely invading organism, please take into account the following. Number one is the age of the patient, then the clinical setting if it is community acquired, post-surgical, or nosocomial. The immune status of the patient, is the patient immunocompromised or immunocompetent? And lastly, the evidence of any systemic or local cranial disease. The most common community-acquired pathogens in adults are Streptococcus pneumoniae, H. influenzae, Group B Streptococcus, Neisseria meningitidis, and Listeria monocytogenes. So these 5 pathogens make up 75% of sporadic cases in adults. H. influenza, which is the main pathogen in children and infants before, has become less and less common with successful vaccination programs, but this remains a problem in developing countries wherein uninoculated adults are also susceptible. The most common pathogens in neonates are E. coli and Group B Streptococcus. And for iatrogenic infections, still Staphylococcus or the gram-negative anaerobic microorganisms. On the left of your screen is the normal appearance of the surface of the brain and the meninges. While on the right, you see there the purulent material covering the surface of the brain. This is our next topic. The left slide here shows us the normal appearance of the leptomeninges, while on the right, you see here the exudates of acute bacterial meningitis made up of leukocytes and bacteria. The immediate effect of a pathogen in the sterile subarachnoid space is to cause inflammatory reaction in the pia, the arachnoid, and the CSF. So once the bacteria arrives in the cerebral circulation, they interact with the endothelial receptors, as we said earlier, causing endocytosis and crossing of the blood-brain barrier. They then populate the subarachnoid spaces. In the meantime, circulating leukocytes also adhere to the endothelium through their adhesion molecules and break down the tight junctions to enter the CSF space as well. This leads to increased permeability of the blood vessels and exudation of the protein and neutrophils. Remember that the CSF also goes around the brain and the spinal cord, and so meningitis spreads in the cerebrospinal space. It's not only in the head, but also in the spinal space. It can also spread inside the ventricles through the choroid plexus or reflux from the foramina of Blushka and Magendie. During the first few days, the neutrophils with the phagocytosed bacteria predominate. Then within a few days, the lymphocytes and histiocytes increased and there is exudation of fibrinogen, which is converted to fibrin. In the latter part of the second week, the plasma cells appear and cellular exudate becomes organized, resulting in fibrosis of the arachnoid and loculation of pockets of exudates. The small and medium-sized subarachnoid arteries are infiltrated by neutrophils. Then the lymphocytes from the adventitia to the subintimal layers, starting at the first 48 hours and increasing in the days that follow. This leads to foci of necrosis and subintimal fibrosis, which is characteristic of subacute and chronic meningitis, most notably tuberculous and syphilitic. So this is what we call infectious vasculitis. The spinal and the cranial nerves become infiltrated only after several days. More often, there is little or no damage to the nerves. In some cases, especially in infants, acute bacterial meningitis may be complicated by sterile subdural effusions. The cerebral cortex also, although not invaded, may also have an increase in microglial and astrocyte reaction. There is some disorder in the cortical neurons that could account for the stupor, convulsions, or coma, and this could be caused by diffusion of toxins from the meninges, circulatory disturbance, increased ICP, or cortical venous thrombosis. During resolution and treatment, the neutrophils disappear by the 4th to the 5th day. Then the lymphocytes, macrophages, and plasma cells disappear more slowly and may remain even after a few months. The completeness of the resolution depends on the stage at which the infection is arrested. If the infection is treated early, there may be no residual change in the arachnoid, but if later treated, there could be some permanent fibrous overgrowth and adhesions between the layers of the meninges. So the most common sporadic cases worldwide caused by the common pathogens occur usually during spring or winter to early spring or the colder months, slightly predominating in males. The fourth most common, which is Listeria, is seen in immunocompromised individuals. We have mentioned in the shift in epidemiology of H. influenzae meningitis because of vaccination programs. Meningococcal meningitis occurs most often in children and adolescents, although they can also be encountered throughout much of adult life. The epidemic meningitis occurs roughly every 10-year cycles. Pneumococcal meningitis predominates in the very young and in the very older adults. Nosocomial infections make up 40% of cases in large urban hospitals, and this perhaps is one of the greatest change in the epidemiology of bacterial meningitis. Usually they are caused by gram-negative bacilli and staphylococcus. Here are the gram-stain appearance of the different common pathogens. So, Neisseria meningitidis are intracellular gram-negative diplococci. So here you can see the diplococci inside a neutrophil. H. influenzae is gram-negative bacilli. Staph pneumoniae are gram-positive diplococci as well, extracellular, and staphylococcus are gram-positive cocci in clusters. The most common pathogens are all normal flora of the nasopharynx and depend on their anti-phagocytic capsules for survival. They also have a predilection to invade the meninges. Postulated factors that predispose to disruption of the blood-CSF barrier and invasion of the bloodstream and meninges include a previous viral infection of the meninges, trauma, and circulating endotoxins. In adults and older children, acute bacterial meningitis usually presents with fever, severe headache, stiffness of the neck, seizures, and altered sensorium. There is nuchal rigidity, Kernig and Brudzinski signs on examination. Infants and newborns present with fever, irritability, drowsiness, convulsions, and bulging fontanelles. Meningitis is more common also somehow among male babies, and maternal infection is the most significant factor. The most commonly causing bacteria in the neonates are the gram-negative Enterobacteria, E. coli, group B streptococci, and they are all normally found in the vagina, urinary tract, and rectum of the mother. So some other characteristic manifestations of the different acute bacterial meningitis are as follows. First one, for meningococcal meningitis, it usually has an extremely rapid evolution, as in hours. And 50% of the time, the patient presents with petechial and large ecchymosis. Okay, like in this picture, so you can see here that some of them may be pinpoint or petechial, or some of them may present with larger, more confluent ecchymosis. They also present with early circulatory shock, and again, they can occur in epidemic settings. For pneumococcal meningitis, they usually follow infections of the lungs and the heart valves, endocarditis, or infections of the ears and the paranasal sinuses. They're more common in alcoholics, plenectomized individuals, in extremes of age, the very young and the very elderly, those with sickle cell disease, and with basal skull fractures. These can also occur as a recurrent bacterial meningitis. Early focal cerebral signs or TADS paralysis after a seizure may happen due to intense focal meningitis. Very important in Haemophilus influenzae is the vaccination status of the child. And usually they follow infections of the ears and the upper respiratory tract. They also present with early focal cerebral signs. As mentioned earlier, staphylococcal meningitis usually follows neurosurgical procedures and placement of shunts and drains. It may also follow infections of the skin like furunculosis. Gram-negative bacteria is also considered as a pathogen in immunosuppressed individuals. For the diagnosis, CSF examination is an indispensable part of the examination of patients suspected with meningitis. So, opening pressure is elevated to more than 180 millimeters water. Pleocytosis could run up to 100,000 per cubic millimeter with neutrophilic predominance around 85 to 95% of the time. Protein is higher than 45 milligrams per dl. Sugar is usually less than 40 milligrams per dl or 40% of the RBS, granted that the RBS should be less than 250 milligrams per dl at the time of extraction. Gram stain and cultures are positive in 70 to 90% of the time, especially if done prior to the instillation of antibiotics. PCR is most helpful and sensitive. You can also have determination of LDH fractions 4 and 5, which is high in acute bacterial meningitis. So this is how we collect the spinal fluid, no? Lumbar puncture in a patient who is in the lateral decubitus position. So we insert the needle under sterile conditions, no? Between L4, L5, or between L3, L4 spinous processes. And then collect the spinal fluid. Here are some examples of CSF collected. Okay, so up here is the normal gross appearance of CSF. It is clear and colorless, transparent, no? And then here you see a slightly yellowish, slightly turbid CSF that can be caused by a lot of diseases. Down here, there is grossly bloody CSF collected from a subarachnoid hemorrhage patient. And here you can compare a turbid purulent CSF to that of a clearer xanthochromic CSF. And then up here in the center, you see here purulent and bloody CSF, probably acute bacterial meningitis from a traumatic top. There is always this concern of the risk of clinical worsening when doing a lumbar puncture. Relatives would usually ask, kakayanin po ba ng bata o ng pasyente? The highest estimates come from studies of Rennick in children who reported this risk at 4% incidence. But it must be pointed out that cerebellar tonsillar herniation may occur in fulminant meningitis independent of lumbar puncture. A head CT scan prior to doing a lumbar puncture revealed abnormalities in those with recent seizures, coma and confusion, or gaze palsy, and only 2% of 235 patients had focal lesions that was adjudged a risk for doing a lumbar puncture. But when there are signs of impending herniation or indications of a dangerous configuration on cerebral images, one may wish to draw blood cultures instead and institute empiric treatment rather than take the small risk of precipitating an herniation with a lumbar puncture. Other helpful tests include blood cultures, which is positive in 40 to 60% of the time when done before instillation of antibiotics. CBC would reveal leukocytosis, often with immature forms. Serum sodium is very low because of SIADH. Chest X-ray may disclose pneumonia or abscess, a source of CNS infection. CT scan can show lesions that erode the skull or the spine and brain abscesses. More helpful would be MRI with gadolinium that demonstrates meningeal exudates and cortical reaction, venous occlusions, and infarctions. This is a contrast-enhanced T1 image of a patient with acute bacterial meningitis showing hyperintensities in the sulci. So this represents leptomeningeal enhancement, suggesting meningitis compared to these areas wherein you do not have these hyperintensities. This is a medical emergency. We need to act fast when we suspect CNS infection. Foremost is to maintain a normal blood pressure and treat septic shock. This is also to protect cerebral perfusion. Choose a bactericidal antibiotic that can penetrate the CSF in effective amounts. So that is what we call meningitic doses. The treatment should be started while awaiting the results of the tests and later changed in accordance with the results. Antibiotics are given IV for at least 10 to 14 days except when there is persistent parameningeal focus. In children in pneumococcal meningitis, dexamethasone may be given prior to the antibiotic dose to prevent neurologic sequelae. Treatment in the recent years has been becoming more and more complicated due to the emergence of resistant strains. The table here lifted from your book is an approximation of the empiric antibiotics in developed countries. The choice of antimicrobials still evolves in the epidemiology, patterns of resistance, and geographic region. These are the meningitic doses of the antimicrobials that we usually use. No? So they are very high doses, very expensive, and potentially toxic. And so it is very important to establish the diagnosis and isolate the organism as much as possible. This table from your book lists the standard and alternative antibiotics for common bacterial pathogens. Again, we usually use the antibiotics with good blood-brain barrier penetrance, usually the third-generation cephalosporins, vancomycin, ampicillin for listeria, and then alternatively meropenem and linezolid. The increased ICP due to cerebral edema is usually managed by giving mannitol or hypertonic saline instead of repeated CSF drainage. Anticonvulsants may also be used to those who develop seizures. All household contacts as well as direct hospital contacts of patients with meningococcal meningitis should be given prophylactic doses of ciprofloxacin or rifampicin. Those particularly vulnerable are the very young and the very elderly. There are also vaccines against H. influenza and Neisseria meningitidis given during infancy and childhood. Untreated acute bacterial meningitis is fatal with the highest mortality rate in streptococcal meningitis. And the most common vulnerable population are those in the extremes of age, the immunocompromised, those with head trauma, and those with concomitant pneumonia and endocarditis. It is very hard to explain the mechanism of death to a specific mechanism. It is usually multifactorial from bacteremia, septic shock, brain swelling, aspiration, and pneumonia. Residual neurologic deficits are found in 25% of influenzae meningitis and 30% of pneumococcal meningitis. Cranial nerve palsies tend to resolve after a few weeks or months, except for deafness, which recovers in only half of the time. Hydrocephalus may also complicate acute bacterial meningitis. Bacteria may also invade the brain itself and cause encephalitis. These are systemic bacterial infections that are complicated by a special type of encephalitis or meningoencephalitis. Mycoplasma infections are usually associated with global encephalitis, if not cerebellitis, or transverse myelitis. They may also present with ADEM or GBS. Listeria and Legionnaire's disease present with focal encephalitis, particularly affecting the brainstem and the cerebellum. Legionella or Legionnaire's disease is usually fatal. The other bacterial meningitidis are less important and quite rare, like anthrax, brucellosis, and cat scratch or encephalitis due to Bartonella bacteria. Now let's move on to the localized infections of the subdural and epidural spaces. The first one is subdural empyema. Subdural empyema is an intracranial suppurative process between the inner surface of the dura and the outer arachnoid. Okay, so the infection usually originates from the frontal and ethmoid sinuses and less frequently from the sphenoid and the middle ear. This gains entry to the subdural space by direct extension to the bone and the dura, or through aseptic sinus thrombosis, or as a result of surgeries to the cranial and sinuses structures. This is more common in adolescent and young adult men. There is usually a history of chronic sinusitis or mastoiditis with a recent flare-up. The headache that is usually localized suddenly becomes severe and generalized, followed by vomiting, drowsiness, seizures, focal deficits, and coma, suggesting intracranial extension. Streptococci, the viridans, and the non-hemolytic are the most frequent, followed by the Bacteroides and anaerobic streptococci. CT scan may show areas of mastoiditis or sinusitis with erosion of the bone and an underlying crescent-shaped area of hypodensity in the subdural space. MRI is more dependable because it can provide additional coronal and sagittal cuts to demonstrate smaller empyema. Remember that LP is not helpful because the infection is not in the CSF compartment, and this is may actually be dangerous because the empyema acts as a mass lesion. Most would require surgical drainage with antibiotic therapy. If misdiagnosed or later diagnosed and untreated, death is usually within 7 to 14 days. Here is a CT scan of a patient with subdural empyema in a patient with concomitant bacterial meningitis. So you see here a large crescent-shaped collection of pus in the subdural space, causing a mass effect, pushing the left cerebrum towards the opposite side, causing the midline shifting of structures. You can also appreciate here a large territorial arterial infarct. Another example here, a coronal view of a patient who has empyema on the left side. So here is the crescent-shaped hypodensity in the subdural space, causing a mass effect, pushing the structures to the right side. And this seems to be originating from an otitis or ear infection on the same side. And then we go to the cranial epidural abscesses. This time, the pus accumulates on the outer surface of the dura, and this is most invariably associated with osteomyelitis in a cranial bone or from its surgeries. Localizing signs are usually absent since the dura is adherent to the bone and somehow restricts its expansion. Again, LP is not advisable and non-contributory. Always consider covering for Staphylococcus aureus infection. Hence, use vancomycin with a third-generation cephalosporin. Surgical drainage may also be needed. Here is the subgaleal abscess with a small intracranial extension, an epidural abscess. Consider Staphylococcus. Another example, a CT scan showing a lentiform or lenticular hypodensity in the frontal area. This is an epidural abscess from a frontal sinusitis. This is actual CT scan with contrast, showing opacification or sclerosis of the left mastoid with an adjacent small epidural empyema or abscess. Septic thrombophlebitis is the infection of the dural venous sinuses of the head. Again, this is infection involving the dural sinuses. The ones usually involved are the lateral, the cavernous, and the petrous sinuses. This is usually complicated by other forms of cranial infections. Usually, it is an extension from the middle ear, the mastoids, and the paranasal sinuses, and also the skin surrounding the upper lip and the nose and eyes. This is usually caused by staphylococcal and streptococcal organisms and presents with fever, intracranial hypertension, cranial nerve palsies, and gaze abnormalities. Prolonged antibiotic treatment is the mainstay of treatment. And after control of the infection is achieved, surgery of the primary focus is decided whether it is still necessary. Here is an example of a septic cavernous thrombosis. So at the center of this slide, you will see the picture of the patient at primary gaze. Notice the ptosis and the congestion and swelling of the left eye. The other four pictures shows us the gaze when the patient is looking up, to the right, to the left, and downwards. And notice that there is a relatively frozen eyeball on the left. So there is limitation in the movement of the eyeball, uh, suggesting that there is involvement of the cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6. On MRI, there is enlargement of the left cavernous sinus and concomitant sphenoid and ethmoid sinusitis. Okay, so the diagram on the right side will show us how the third, the fourth, and the sixth cranial nerves are affected inside because they are all inside or closely related to the cavernous sinus. Aside from the third, fourth, and sixth, the V1 and the V2 are also affected. Lastly, we have brain abscesses. Encapsulated or free pus can also form in the substance of the brain. More often, they come from hematogenous spread from the heart and the lungs, and they usually form multiple abscesses, although sometimes the abscesses may also be solitary. They may also come from infection of the paranasal sinuses, the mastoids, and the middle ear by direct extension and spread through thrombophlebitis. So in these cases, there are usually solitary abscesses. In 20% of the time, the sources cannot be ascertained. Here is an abscess in a fresh specimen. You can see here the whitish exudate at the center of the necrotic tissue surrounded by the capsule. Okay, and this abscess acts as a mass lesion, causing midline shifting of structures again, and possibly herniation and the demise of this patient. Brain abscesses are usually polymicrobial. Consider the virulent streptococci, anaerobic and microaerophilic, coming from the lungs and the paranasal sinuses, in combination with other anaerobes like the Bacteroides and Propionibacterium. Okay, staphylococcal infections are presumed in particular settings like skin infections, surgeries, and head injury. The type of organism depends on the source of the abscess. Initially, there is septic thrombosis of the blood vessels leading to tissue necrosis and subsequent local suppurative process. Within several days, the infection becomes delimited, and the center of the infection takes on the character of pus. As the abscess becomes more chronic, the periphery grows granulation tissue and later on collagenous connective tissue, which forms the capsule. The capsule is characteristically thinner on the ventricular side so that if ever it ruptures, it will rupture to the ventricles. Headaches is the most frequent initial symptom. Drowsiness and confusion, focal and generalized seizures, and focal neurologic deficits follow. There is fever and leukocytosis in only 50% of the time because during the encapsulated stage of the abscess, the fever and leukocytosis disappear. The symptoms may evolve in a treacherous and unpredictable course even if the patient seems to be stable because of the sudden rupture of an abscess. Contrast-enhanced CT and MRI are most important. If negative, there is almost no likelihood of an abscess. Blood cultures, 2D echoes, especially with acute endocarditis, are done. ESR and chest X-ray are also contributory. Here is a CT scan of a developing cerebellar abscess here on the right and compressing on the fourth ventricle, causing obstructive hydrocephalus. Okay, so this also seemed to be coming from right-sided mastoiditis in this case. During the stage of cerebritis or early abscess formation, you can just give the patient antibiotics. So in this case, it would be a combination of vancomycin, a third-generation cephalosporin, and either meropenem or metronidazole to cover for all the possible pathogens. For staphylococcal infection, you may also use nafcillin. Only if the abscess is solitary, superficial, or encapsulated, or associated with a foreign body should total excision of the abscess be attempted. If the abscess is deep, stereotactic aspiration is the current method of choice, if available. Here is a CT scan of a patient who was treated with stereotactic aspiration. So here is the before and then after aspiration of the abscess. Notice that there is still residual edema. If the treatment is started while the patient is alert, mortality is at 5 to 10%, even with multiple abscesses. But if the patient is already comatose before treatment, mortality is more than 50%. 30% of survivors have neurologic deficits, that is, usually focal deficits or epilepsy. Now let's move on to the subacute and chronic meningitis. There are microorganisms that induce inflammation of the meninges of lesser intensity and chronicity and present with a more protracted clinical course. They are also more difficult to detect and culture, and the most important of them would be TB and neurosyphilis. It may also be caused, subacute and chronic meningitis may also be caused by fungal, Lyme disease, HIV, and non-infectious conditions like lymphomas, carcinomatosis, or granulomatous diseases. They present differently from the acute bacterial meningitis. They present more with confusion or cognitive decline, seizures, an absence of lateralizing and focal cerebral signs, with or without headaches. They may also have mild stiffness of the neck. In most cases, there is little or no fever and other manifestations of infection. TB meningitis is caused more often than not by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. There has been a steady decrease in the cases of TB since World War II, but since 1985 there has been a moderate increase again, but not exclusively because of the HIV epidemic. So it has been proposed that firstly, there is bacterial seeding of the meninges and the subpial regions of the brain and formation of the tubercles. Then this is followed by the rupture of one or more of these tubercles and discharge of bacteria into the subarachnoid space. The meningitis is most intense in the basal meninges. Unlike the typical bacterial meningitis, the disease is not confined to the subarachnoid space. It also invades the underlying brain. So therefore, it is actually a meningoencephalitis. The cranial nerves are frequently involved as they traverse the basal inflammatory exudates more often than the acute bacterial meningitis does. Arteries become inflamed and occluded, leading to infarctions. Hydrocephalus forms because of blockage of basal cisterns, and multiple spinal radiculopathies and cord compression occurs if the exudate predominate around the spinal cord. So here is a specimen which shows you the exudates at the base of the brain. And notice that the cranial nerves and the major arteries of the circle of Willis are obscured in this picture because of the basal exudates. So this disease occurs in persons of all ages. Initially, they may present with low-grade fever, malaise, headaches, lethargy, confusion, and stiff neck with Kernig's and Brzezinski signs. These present over a week or two, sometimes longer. And in the chronic stage, cranial nerve palsies, papilledema, and focal neurologic deficits because of infarction appear. Two-thirds have evidence of active tuberculosis elsewhere, like in the lymph nodes or in the lungs. If untreated, it is usually fatal within 4 to 8 weeks of onset. Treatment of HIV is of paramount importance in TBN in HIV, and it has been recommended that it should be started within 2 weeks of the onset of anti-tuberculosis therapy. The CSF this time in TB meningitis would look slightly cloudy or with an appearance of ground glass with formation of a clot on standing. WBC is 25 to 500 per cubic millimeter with lymphocytic predominance. The sugar is low but not as low as in acute bacterial meningitis. The protein is usually high, very high. There is positive AFB smear, but this is inconsistent. TB PCR is more reliable, and you should be able to have a negative serology for Cryptococcus and syphilis, which present with the same CSF picture. Here are CT scan and MRI pictures of the basal exudates. No? So these hyperintensities, okay, in the basal meninges. This also caused somehow hydrocephalus, causing dilatation of the ventricles. This is an MRI also showing the basal exudates. On the right here, you see a tuberculoma, no, which looks like a brain abscess also, no, surrounded by an area of edema. For the treatment, we usually start at least with a quadruple anti-TB regimen for 2 months, no? So with INH, rifampicin, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol, with or without streptomycin. Then followed by 8 to 10 months of at least double anti-TB antibiotics, usually INH and rifampicin. In the Philippines, there is a high rate of INH-resistant organisms. So second-line drugs may be used, would include ethionamide and moxifloxacin. We usually give, or you should give, pyridoxine 50 milligrams a day to prevent INH neuropathy. Corticosteroids in conjunction with anti-TB medicines may be used to those who have subarachnoid block or raised intracranial pressure. Tuberculomas that do not disappear with medication may be excised if there is a mass effect. So the overall mortality is still significant at 10%, infants and the elderly being at greatest risk. HIV-positive patients have a higher mortality, of course, at 21%. When coma has supervened before treatment, the mortality is at 50%, and 20 to 30% of survivors have residual neurologic sequelae. Drug resistance in some areas as a result of intermittent, ineffective treatment resort to DOTS. And then we have the less common neurosyphilis. Just like CNS TB, there has been a decline in the incidence of neurosyphilis after World War II because of the discovery of penicillin, it being an effective treatment already for the genital syphilis. However, in recent years, there has been an increase in reported cases in HIV again, as well as in immunocompetent patients. Instead of the parenchymal type of the neurosyphilis, however, the meningovascular is now the more common type, particularly in HIV. So this is caused by a slender spiral motile treponema pallidum. The treponin invades the CNS within 3 to 18 months of inoculation. And the initial event is a meningitis. And this occurs in 25% of those who have syphilis. The meningitis can be asymptomatic and can only be discovered by lumbar puncture. Asymptomatic neurosyphilis is the important form because treatment at this stage can prevent further symptomatic varieties. Here is the picture of the organism. And here are photos showing the clinical manifestations of syphilis, particularly the secondary and the tertiary forms. So, can be seen in the penis, the inguinal lymph nodes, the tongue, the palms and the soles, the face, then lastly the brain. So this brain already showed significant atrophy already. And here we have the principal types of neurosyphilis, and as we have said, the asymptomatic type or stage that presents only with abnormal CSF is the one that is most important to catch. So why do we do lumbar puncture in these patients? So for those who have syphilis with very high serum titers of the treponema antigen, okay, we advise them to undergo lumbar puncture to detect this asymptomatic type. Okay, And then we have the meningovascular presenting with meningitis and strokes. So these are the ones that are more common nowadays. And then lastly, we have the parenchymatous type of syphilis. How do we diagnose and treat them? So there should be a syndrome consistent with neurosyphilis, an abnormal blood titer of the treponemal antibody test, and a positive non-treponemal antibody test in the CSF. Treatment is with high doses of IV penicillin for 14 days. All forms of neurosyphilis should be re-examined every 3 to 4 months, and CSF examination after 6 months. There are also other spirochetal infections, no? And the first one is Lyme's disease. So this is not common here in Asia, but is more relevant in the Americas and Europe. This is caused by Borrelia burgdorferi from tick bites, no? Ticks of common deer. They successively involve the skin and they present with erythema chronicum migrans. This is how the skin lesion would look like, erythema chronicum migrans. And then for the nervous system, they will present with acute radicular pains followed by lymphocytic meningitis and frequently with peripheral and cranial neuropathies. They will then affect the heart and the articular surfaces of the joints over a period of a year or longer. Treatment is with doxycycline. Leptospirosis is also a spirochetal infection. No? So this is caused by Leptospira interrogans, and we had a fair share of leptospirosis here in the Philippines. No? So this rarely causes encephalitis, myelitis, and optic neuritis. But in the past, during the Ondoy typhoon, we have seen a patient with myelitis and polyradiculitis from leptospirosis. And that is my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention.